And welcome back to another podcast. This is Mr. Hagan, and on this econ podcast, we're going to take a look at the production. We're going to take a look at the production possibilities model, also sometimes called the Robinson Crusoe model, also sometimes called the Guns and Butter model. I refer to it right now as the production possibilities model. And what we're going to do with this model is we are going to assume that there is one person who has been shipwrecked on an island, and they're on the island all by themselves, and they can produce two goods, guns or butter. And this person's going to have to decide how many guns and butters to produce in order to make themselves happy. Not just to make themselves happy, but to maximize their happiness or maximize their utility. So whenever we build a model like this, we first lay out our assumptions very clearly, things we're going to pretend that are true even though they're not. And that's in order to simplify the world, to simplify our model. So we are going to assume in this case that there are fixed resources. Now remember, your resources are land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurial skills. So we're going to assume that we have this person on the island all by themselves. Let's say Robinson Crusoe, shipwrecked on an island all by himself. And he has available to himself land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurial skills. Secondly, we're going to assume that technology on this island is fixed. That's a pretty reasonable assumption. He's trapped there all by himself. Number three, we're going to assume fixed rules for society. So that just means that it really isn't relevant if there's only one person on the island. But if there would be many people on the island and they would have a government, then we would be assuming that the fixed rules for society would be how well the government is currently protecting private property rights. Number four, we're going to assume productive efficiency. We'll talk about what that means a little later in the podcast. And finally, we're going to assume there's only two goods available in the world for Crusoe to produce, and they are going to be butter and guns. That's the reason why it's sometimes called a guns and butter model. So that Crusoe can either produce guns with his resources or butter with his resources. So let's go ahead and take a look at what Crusoe's choices are. So trapped on this island Crusoe is trapped on this island all by himself, and he can produce either butter or guns. And we're going to assume that he goes around the island and he finds the following things to be true. He finds that when he produces 0 butter, he can produce 7 guns in some time period. So if he puts all his efforts toward if he puts all his effort towards guns, he would produce 0 butter, he can make 7 guns. If he increases his butter production from 0 to 1, so now he produces 1 unit of butter, well, that's going to take some time, and it's going to take time away from producing guns. So he won't be able to produce guns anymore. He'll still be able to produce guns, but not 7 guns. He's going to have to give some up. Maybe he's only now going to be able to produce 6.8 guns. And if he produces 2 butter, he can produce 6.2 guns. 3 butter, he can produce 5 guns, and so on and so forth. 4 butter, 3.2 guns, 5 butter, and 0 guns. This would be if he produced all butter and spent no time producing guns. So this is called right here, this is called his production possibilities schedule. It's the list of what's possible. It's the list of what he can produce with his land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurial skills. But the economics question is not what can he produce. The economics question is which combinations of guns and butter will make him the happiest? Which combination will maximize his utility? Well, in order to figure out what makes us happy, we know already now that decisions are made on the margin, so that a person looks at their marginal benefits and compares that to their marginal costs when they're making a decision. So for Crusoe, one of the things we have to do is we have to calculate the marginal cost. So let's look specifically at the good butter. What if Crusoe was considering producing and therefore consuming butter. So how much butter should he produce? Well, we want to calculate what is the marginal cost of producing butter and what is the total cost of producing butter. Now, we're only going to calculate total cost just to kind of compare it to marginal cost, because we don't really need this, because people don't make decisions by looking at totals. They make decisions by looking at the margins. All right, so let's look at how this calculation would work. So right now we're assuming that Crusoe is producing 0 butter and 7 guns. So there's no marginal cost to calculate there. But let's say now that he wants to increase his butter production from 0 butter to 1 butter. Well, if he does that, if he spends some time producing butter, he's going to have to spend less time producing guns, and therefore his gun production would drop from 7 to, let's say, 6.8 guns. So in order to add one more unit of butter over here, the time that he spends doing that is going to cause him to have to reduce his gun production. So let's see, in this case, that means that his marginal cost is going to be, his marginal cost is going to be 0.2, right? Because when he added 1 butter, he had to give up 0.2 guns. He used to be able to produce 7 guns. Now he can only produce 6.8 guns. So he had to give up 0.2 guns. Now, what if he adds yet another butter? What if he goes from producing 1 butter to 2 units of butter? Well, now his gun production is going to fall from 6.8 down to 6.2. So he's going to have to give up 0.6 guns. Now, how many guns has he given up total? Well, when he produced 1 butter, he had to give up 0.2 guns. When he produces 2 butter, he gave up 0.2 guns for the first unit of butter, and he had to give up an additional 0.6 guns for the second unit of butter. So if he produces 2 units of butter, his total cost would be 0.8. Let's take a look if he adds yet another unit of butter. If he produces a third unit of butter, now his gun production is going to fall from 6.2 down to 5. So that means that his marginal cost is going to be 1.2. And his total cost now is going to be, well, it was 0.8, and now we added another 1.2 guns that we had to give up. So my total cost is now going to go to 2. What about the fourth butter? So if we produce the fourth unit of butter, then our gun production falls from 5 to 3.2. So we're going to have to give up, that'd be 1.8 guns. That's my marginal cost. And now my total cost is going up to 3.8. Was 2. Another 1.8 was added to the marginal cost when we produced the fourth unit, getting my total cost up to 3.8. And then finally, that fifth unit of butter, if I produce that fifth unit of butter, that becomes, the marginal cost gets very high. I have to give up 3.2 guns to do that. And my total cost would now be 7. Now, of course, we don't have to worry about the total cost so much because decisions are made on the margin. So it's right here. It's the margin that matters. The marginal cost is what matters. So it's going to be these marginal costs that we're going to have to look at to decide how many units of butter will Robinson Crusoe produce. How many units of butter will maximize his happiness. So to do that, let's go ahead and draw a graph of this. So up here in the corner, I have my butter and guns, my production possibilities schedule, and I have my marginal cost. Now let's just remind ourselves what this marginal cost is. These are the additional guns given up for one more unit of butter. They are additional guns given up for one more unit of butter. So let's get a graph up here. So on my graph, the first graph, I'm going to, on the vertical axis, I'm going to measure guns. And on the horizontal axis, I'm going to measure butter. And let's see, I could produce how many guns? So I could produce, let's see, it was anywhere from 0 to 7 guns. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or 7. And what about for butter? I could produce 1 unit of butter, 2 units, 3, 4, or 5. So then I want to go ahead and I want to graph it. So the first thing I'm going to graph, the first production possibility set is 0 butter and 7 guns. So 0 butter, 7 guns would be right there. That would be possible. Or Crusoe could produce 1 butter and 6.8 guns. So that would be 1 butter, 6.8 guns. That'd be like maybe right there. Or he could produce 2 butter and 6.2 guns, and that might be, say, maybe right there. Or, where am I getting these? I'm getting these from right here. I could produce 3 butter and 5 guns. So that would be 3 butter, 5 guns. That would be right here. 4 butter, 3.2 guns. Or 5 butter and 0 guns. That would be right there. So if I connect those dots, then I have a production possibilities curve. So that's my production possibilities curve. Now, when we look at that production possibilities curve, let's first label some things, some general concepts, and then we'll get back to answering our question of how much butter should Robinson Crusoe produce. So before we get to that, before we do that, let's label some things, and then I think that'll finish up this podcast. So the first thing that we want to label is we want to label what would happen if we produce somewhere inside the curve. So for example, we could produce right here. That would be 2 butter and 2 guns. So if we produce there, what would we say about that point? We would say that point is attainable but inefficient. So that means we can do it, but we could have done better. In fact, any point that is inside the curve, any point that is in here, we would call attainable but inefficient. We could do it, but we could have done better. And then, what about if a point is actually outside the curve? So, for example, 5 butter and 7 guns. So what could I say about that point right there? Well, I would say that point would be unattainable with our current land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurial skills. If Crusoe produced 5 butter, he would not be able to produce any guns, let alone be able to produce 7 guns. So 5 butter and 7 guns, that is unattainable. And then finally, so any point inside the curve is going to be attainable but inefficient. Any point outside the curve is just going to be unattainable. You can't do it. And then what about on the curve? Any point on this curve we would call attainable and efficient. Attainable and efficient. That means we can do it, but we could not have done any better. Attainable and efficient. We can do it, and we can't do any better. Those are the 3 sets of areas on the curve. So I'm going to run out of time here on this podcast. On the next podcast, we will get back to the question of how many butter and how many guns should Crusoe produce. We'll take a look at that on the next podcast. Thanks for joining us. This has been Mr. Hagan. See you on the next podcast.